If you are new to our channel, please like, subscribe, hit that little bell notification. It really does help us out. I'm so glad to be talking about UFOs again after
Corona.
After Corona. It's so much more
fun, isn't it? Yeah.
So you got all these instances we're talking about, and then you've got the big one, the greatest band in the history of music, the Foo Fighters. Dave Grohl is God, and I don't care what anybody says. My favourite quote is, "You should always be yourself. You know, be you, unless you can be more like Dave Grohl, in which case, be Dave." So the Foo Fighters in World War II, they were, again, this was the thing, it was corroborated views. We've got a fair few photos. It was American, British, and German pilots seeing these things.
Yes. No, it's pretty much anybody that was involved in the war on either side in the air pretty much saw the Foo Fighters. If you just think about the increased activity in that period, just think about the First World War. We didn't really use aeroplanes a huge amount, did we? I mean, they had
no Sopwith Camels and things. These paper aeroplanes.
World War II was the first war on a continental/global scale.
Yep.
Started involving new technology with us flying a lot, dropping bombs.
Yeah.
The atomic
mass bombs, weren't we? We weren't. And World War One, they used to have little, like, basically grenades that they just sort of dropped out the side of the plane. By World War II, we were carpet bombing. You know, so we were able to wipe out cities, which we hadn't been able to do before. This was a completely different type of warfare.
And I'm just, all of this destructive activity might be another reason that the number of UFO sightings and reports of downed UFO craft increased so much, and maybe not so linked to radar interfering with them. Maybe it's that if there is a species out there that was monitoring us and can travel between the stars, maybe they then suddenly took more of an interest in us because of the destructive nature and the power of the destructive weapons that we were creating.
Perhaps. If you're thinking that they were watching us and they were like the historians of their time, but it's sort of like how we research tribes in the Amazon and things like this, and we're really interested in how they live and how they're different. And aliens might be watching us going, like, you know, why are they doing this? You know, war might be very alien to them, so they're very interested.
Aliens watching us is like us watching the David Attenborough nature documentary about insects.
Well, yeah. I do also wonder, I remember there's do you remember Stargate SG-1, that TV series?
Yes.
There was a plot in that where these replicators appeared, right? And they had the Asgard with a very high-tech, super intelligent, they're little greys, basically. That's what in the show they were supposed to be. And these replicators appeared, and they just couldn't do anything about it. They were so... all their weapons just didn't work. The replicators just absorbed it, and their laser weapons things didn't work. The one thing that did work was shotguns. And they make the point, say, in the series, we wouldn't think to get gunpowder and a projectile and fire it down the thing. It's like hitting them with a stick sort of thing to them. They just wouldn't understand it as a weapon. But it worked. You know, it worked because, again, the replicators didn't understand it as well. So I do wonder about that. Maybe when we started firing shells and all this metal was in the air and stuff, it could have been, we could have ended up shooting them down just because it was technology. They would sort of like, who the hell would just throw a massive chunk of metal into the sky?
Well, exactly. And the fear and hostility amongst many nations during that period between, you know, World War II, 39 to 45. And then the hysteria that's still going to go on even after the war's ended if they do see an unidentified craft in the sky, you know, protect your country, your defences. You can understand how potentially some of these things were shot down by military of various countries.
There are theories that the UFO seen over Los Angeles during the Battle of LA was actually shot down and recovered by the US Army. It was this UFO, when reverse engineered, that led to the Manhattan Project and unlocked the secrets that then allowed us to build the first nuclear weapon. We talk about Bob Lazar. He says one of the aircraft in Area 51 that he saw, one of the UFOs, looked like it had been hit by something, looked like it had been shelled. It had a big hole in it, sort of thing. So maybe. Some of the images we see were sent by Germans. Again, it's like the classic UFOs, these Foo Fighters, glowing balls of energy. And our governments were really interested in it at the time because they were worried it actually might be like a Wunder weapon, one of these, because the Germans were developing stuff that we were well behind, and we were terrified, particularly sort of towards the end of the war, when they were starting to put jet fighters into the aircraft. We were still using Spitfires.
The Nazi Bell experiment was supposedly where they were experimenting with reverse engineering the technology from a downed craft from the 30s, from the early 30s in the Black Forest, I believe, in Germany. And the Nazi Bell was supposedly then working on the propulsion system that they reverse engineered from that craft. And that's the Nazi Bell has the same saucer-shaped disc object with a bell on the top, hence the Nazi Bell.
At the end of the war, the Americans took full advantage and took as many of the German scientists as they could get their hands on back to the US. Could this have included scientists working on UFO technology? Some even think that the Roswell incident was not really a UFO at all, but perhaps a Nazi Bell experiment gone wrong.
Where they sort of did tests on that is still there, and there's this concrete stand with a circle where it was hung. So, I mean, I want to do a series on the Nazis. And I'd like to do pre-war, post-war, and post, and during the war sort of thing, because they were up to stuff that.
Why do you
doesn't
think
make sense?
Operation Paperclip was put into action by the Americans to steal most of the German scientists, well, to stop the Russians getting them, for one, because they knew they had technology that they didn't know about, that they needed to know about, and then you then think about all of the money that's gone into the defence contractors in Area 51, like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, which is black budget money that disappears and it's never accounted for. And
hundreds of billions.
They're the companies that have had access probably to the technologies and to the developments of the scientists that were taken from Operation Paperclip predominantly. Apart from obvious ones like Werner von Braun, who used his life passion of rockets to get Americans to the moon.
He was the father of NASA, wasn't he?
Yes.
Very easily, and he was a Nazi, and he was a full-blown unpleasant Nazi as well. He had no problem with using children in the factories in Germany because they had little hands. And some of the chemical injuries and things, the slaves that were working for him were horrific, and he didn't care because he cared about the science. But you can give him the respect to that. He was a focused individual. But he wasn't a humanitarian. This wasn't Schindler by any stretch, because it suited. I suppose. Oh, no, that's not fair, really. I don't think like the political ideology was probably interested to him. It was a way of getting what he wanted, which was the science and the technology.
Probably, I think that'd probably be the same with a lot of the scientists. I imagine that's common amongst a lot of the Germans.
A lot of other scientists. There are famous stories about the Germans. A certain German scientist, I can't remember his name now, who was the nuclear physicist and a nuclear specialist, and he actively blocked the Nazis getting a nuclear weapon. Because then, when the news reached Germany that they'd tested the first nuclear weapon, all the scientists went, "Well, it's impossible. It's impossible. It doesn't work." And the scientists went up and went, "No, it does," and showed them the maths. Because he knew the war was over for Germany and it was right. He understood how to make a nuclear weapon and he actively blocked it. Von Braun knew how to build the V1 and then the V2 and didn't have a problem with it because the science was maybe more important to him. I don't know, but
maybe I don't know. I think Werner von Braun was quite a high-ranking member, wasn't he? He was in the SS, I believe, wasn't he?
Churchill was aware of the Foo Fighters, was actually quite concerned about it. In 1999, the grandson, who was a scientist in Leicester, came forward and he said on his deathbed, his granddad had told him about a meeting, and he was apparently one of Churchill's bodyguards. And he told him about a meeting between Churchill and Eisenhower where they agreed to hush the UFO situation up.
Allegedly in the meeting, Eisenhower and Churchill discussed a UFO sighting off the south coast of England. Unfortunately, we don't know when or where exactly this sighting was supposed to have happened. Apparently there was an image taken of the UFO which Churchill saw, but that we've never seen.
The reasoning, they said, was they didn't want people talking about UFOs during the war, particularly Churchill was, a strong Christian. He was very concerned that it would sort of shake people's beliefs at a time, again, where we're at war, but also just cause panic. People were scared enough as it was. If there was this story about, well, people would either assume it was a German weapon that, again, like the V2, we couldn't defend ourselves against.
Yep.
Or, like I say, worse, they actually believed it was something else, another threat, at a time when we were
already under threat. Yeah.
Another massive threat. There were documents as well, apparently, that Eisenhower wrote to the president, saying this in, but they're whether they're true or not is a bit questionable. But again, saying the same thing, that they were going to actively suppress the news on UFOs and these Foo Fighters, because they were getting on some front page news. This was stuff people were talking about. So it was actively like, this is what, right now, this is like one more thing we don't need to talk about. And to be honest, I can understand that. I think government at the time probably would be very interested in censoring it and blocking it.
It's very similar,
particularly if they didn't know what it was.
Yeah. Very similar to the way they censored the Spanish flu. Well, it was only named the Spanish flu because the Spanish press was the only country to report the flu and the deaths occurring across Europe. But most of the countries didn't want to report that in the papers as fear of people not wanting to go to the front line, I guess.
Yeah.
World War I. So it wouldn't be the first time that they've done something like that.
A similar thing, I suppose, as well, isn't it? They want people focused on the war effort, not panicking about a pandemic.
Yes,
they don't want people scared, even more scared than they already are, sort of thing, maybe.
Yeah.
But this same thing interests me about what governments knew about the UFO incidents and the Foo Fighters. Because again, in 1952, following the thing we're going to talk about in a minute, the Washington Flap, Churchill did write a memo to his head of defense saying, what is it with this UFO thing? Is it something we need to be worried about? And he did get the response saying, we are aware of it. Most instances aren't anything to worry about. There are a few, but there's no threat to defense.
Yeah.
But that shows that the British government and the head of the British government, because he was Prime Minister at the time, knew that something was going on, but at least the head of the government didn't know what it was. Other elements of the government might have known more, and because, like we always say, prime ministers come and go, and presidents come and go. They don't necessarily know everything.
They're temporary employees. That's the way the deep state in America looks at the president. Temporary employee.